The thunder cracked across the Montana sky as Harriet Evans clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, squinting through the torrential downpour at the broken wagon wheel that had finally given way after miles of rough terrain. Just 3 days into her journey to Virginia City, and already fate seemed determined to strand her in the middle of nowhere with night fast approaching. It was 1873, and a woman alone on the frontier faced dangers that made a broken wagon seem like the least of her worries. "Damn it all," she muttered, kicking at the splintered wood with the toe of her boot. The entire bottom of the wagon had split clean through, her worldly possessions now sagging dangerously close to the muddy ground. She'd been warned about traveling alone, but after her father's death, what choice did she have? The teaching position waiting for her in Virginia City wouldn't wait forever. "Looks like you could use some help, madam." Harriet whirled around, nearly losing her footing in the mud. A tall figure on horseback had materialized through the curtain of rain, the brim of his hat pulled low. Her hand instinctively moved toward the small Derringer pistol concealed in her pocket. "No need for that," the man said, dismounting with fluid grace that belied his size. "Garrett Reynolds," he offered, removing his hat and revealing a face weathered by sun and wind, but with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. "I noticed your predicament from the ridge back there." Harriet studied him cautiously. His clothes were worn but clean, his manner straightforward. Not a bandit, she decided, but experience had taught her to be wary nonetheless. "Harriet Evans," she replied, keeping her distance. "As you can see, Mr. Reynolds, I've had some misfortune with my transportation." He moved past her and crouched beside the wagon, examining the damage with practiced eyes. Rain streamed off his oilskin coat as he ran his fingers along the splintered wood. "The wagon split beneath the rain," he said, looking up at her with an unexpected smile. "Bad luck, but we'll fix it together." Harriet raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Reynolds, while I appreciate your assessment, I hardly know you." He stood, towering over her 5'4" frame but keeping a respectful distance. "Fair enough, Miss Evans. But night's coming and this storm isn't letting up. My ranch is about 3 miles east of here. I can offer you shelter, help with repairs in the morning, and you can be on your way." As if to emphasize his point, lightning split the sky, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Harriet's horse whinnied nervously, pulling at its tether. "I suppose I don't have much choice," she conceded. "There's always a choice," Garrett said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "But some are wiser than others. Let's gather your essentials and secure the rest. I promise you'll be safe." Something in his tone made her believe him, despite every cautionary tale she'd ever heard about trusting strangers on the frontier. "Very well," she nodded, already calculating what she could afford to leave behind if necessary. "But I warn you, Mr. Reynolds, I'm an excellent shot." His laugh was unexpected, a rich sound that somehow cut through the gloom of the storm. "I don't doubt it, Miss Evans. Now, shall we get started before we both drown standing up?" Harriet couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips as they began to work together in the rain, unaware that this broken wagon would be the beginning of something neither of them had been looking for. Within the hour, they had salvaged her most important belongings and secured the wagon as best they could. Garrett helped her onto his horse, then led the animal by the reins, walking alongside her through the mud and rain. Harriet sat stiffly at first, uncomfortable with the intimacy of riding a stranger's mount, but as the miles stretched on, fatigue gradually overcame her resolve. "Tell me, Miss Evans, what brings you to these parts alone?" Garrett asked, his voice raised slightly above the rain. "I've accepted a teaching position in Virginia City," she replied. "The school term begins in 2 weeks. A school teacher." There was genuine respect in his voice. "They're sorely needed. Last teacher left after one winter claimed Montana territory was trying to freeze her to death." "I'm made of sturdier stuff," Harriet said, though privately she wondered if that was true. She'd grown up in Boston, sheltered from the harsh realities of frontier life. Her father's sudden death had left her with few options, the teaching post a lifeline she'd grasped with both hands. "I can see that," Garrett replied, and though she couldn't see his face, she heard the smile in his voice. "Most city folk would be in hysterics by now." "Who says I'm not in hysterics?" she retorted. "I'm simply having them quietly and with dignity." His laugh rumbled up again, and strangely it made the cold rain seem less penetrating. As the landscape changed, rolling hills giving way to a small valley, Harriet spotted lights glowing through the gray curtain of rain. A substantial log house came into view, smoke curling from its stone chimney despite the downpour. Several outbuildings and corrals surrounded it, the Reynolds Ranch, apparently larger and more established than she'd expected. "Home," Garrett announced simply, leading the horse into a barn where they could finally escape the relentless rain. The warmth of the barn was immediate relief. As Garrett helped her down from the saddle, Harriet was acutely aware of his hands at her waist, strong but careful. She stepped away quickly, adjusting her sodden skirts. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds," she said formally, trying to regain some sense of propriety despite her bedraggled appearance. "Garrett," he corrected, already busying himself with the horse. "Mr. Reynolds was my father." "Then I must insist on Miss Evans," she replied, lifting her chin slightly. The ghost of a smile played across his features. "As you wish, Miss Evans. Let's get you inside and dried off. My housekeeper, Mrs. Wilkins, will help you get settled." The main house was warm and surprisingly well appointed. Harriet had expected a bachelor's sparse quarters, but instead found a home with polished wooden floors, quality furniture, and shelves lined with books that immediately caught her eye. Mrs. Wilkins turned out to be a stout, no-nonsense woman in her 60s who clucked over Harriet like a mother hen, whisking her away to a bedroom where dry clothes apparently belonging to Garrett's sister-in-law and a hot bath awaited. "Mr. Reynolds radioed ahead," the older woman explained, noting Harriet's surprise. "He's got one of them newfangled telegraph lines running to the main house, only ranch in 50 miles with such a thing. His brother was always bringing modern touches before he and his wife moved to Denver." Harriet soaked in the copper tub until her fingers wrinkled, the hot water easing aches she hadn't even realized she had. She dressed in the borrowed clothes, a simple but well-made navy skirt and cream blouse that fit reasonably well, and dried her hair by the fire. By the time she emerged, evening had fallen completely. She found Garrett in the dining room, freshly changed himself, setting out a simple but hearty meal of beef stew, bread, and coffee. "Mrs. Wilkins has gone home to her husband," he explained, holding out a chair for her. "She lives in the cottage just beyond the apple trees. Hope you don't find it improper to dine alone with me, but I promise my intentions are honorable. Necessity often trumps propriety on the frontier. I'm learning," Harriet replied, taking the offered seat. "Besides, you've been nothing but a gentleman." They ate in surprisingly comfortable silence for a few minutes before Garrett spoke again. "Tomorrow we'll go back for your wagon. I've got tools and lumber. We should be able to get it fixed well enough to get you to Virginia City." "You're very kind to help a stranger this way," Harriet said, studying him across the table. In the lamplight, she could see his features more clearly, strong jaw darkened with stubble, straight nose that looked like it might have been broken once, and eyes the color of the sea during a storm. Handsome in a rugged way that would never be fashionable in Boston drawing rooms. "Not much kindness in helping," he said with a shrug. Just doing what needs doing. Anyone would. We both know that's not true, she countered. Plenty would ride right past or offer help with unsavory expectations. A shadow crossed his face. Then plenty aren't worth the air they breathe. My father taught us better. Us, my brother Thomas and me. He moved to Denver 3 years ago, banking business. This was supposed to be our place together, but he found city life suited him better after he married. And you preferred to stay, Harriet observed. Garrett nodded, refilling their coffee cups. Can't imagine being hemmed in by city walls. Out here, a man can breathe. Or freeze to death, according to your former schoolteacher, Harriet added with a small smile. He chuckled. There is that risk. Winter's harsh, but spring makes you forget all that. You should see these valleys in May, wildflowers for miles. So many colors it almost hurts your eyes. The wistful note in his voice surprised her. This was not the coarse, uneducated cowboy of Eastern newspapers' frontier tales. There was depth to him, a quiet intelligence that intrigued her. Tell me about Virginia City, she said. What should I expect? It's growing fast. The gold's mostly played out, but there's still plenty of silver in them hills. It's civilizing. Some got a proper courthouse now, 3 churches, even an opera house. But it's still rough around the edges. He hesitated. Teaching won't be easy. You'll have children from mining families, ranchers, shopkeepers, some who have never set foot in a schoolroom before. I'm prepared for challenges, Harriet said, though her confidence wavered slightly. I'm sure you are, Garrett replied, his eyes meeting hers across the table with an intensity that made her look away first. Just know that folks out here value straight talk and hard work above fancy education. Win their respect, and you'll do fine. Later, lying in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the rain still drumming on the roof, Harriet found herself thinking about Garrett Reynolds more than she should. There was something compelling about him, a strength that didn't need to announce itself, a kindness offered without expectation. She reminded herself firmly that her purpose here was clear. Establish herself as Virginia City's teacher, create a new life independent of anyone else. Romance had no place in her plans. Yet as sleep finally claimed her, it was the sound of his laugh that followed her into her dreams. Morning broke clear and bright, the storm having washed the world clean. Harriet woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, and the realization that she'd slept better than she had in months. She dressed quickly in her own clothes, now dried and pressed Mrs. Wilkins' doing, no doubt, and made her way to the kitchen. Garrett stood at the stove, his back to her, humming softly as he flipped pancakes in a cast-iron skillet. Good morning, she said, causing him to turn. Morning, Miss Evans. Sleep well. Better than I expected, she admitted, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. Thank you. Thought we'd head out after breakfast, he said, placing a plate before her. Weather's cleared, but the creek might be running high after that rain. Harriet nodded, surprised at the quality of the breakfast. You're quite the cook, Mr. Garrett. A pleased smile crossed his face at her use of his first name. Bachelor living teaches a man a few things. Can't survive on beans and jerky forever. And yet you keep Mrs. Wilkins employed. She manages the house and helps when I've got ranch hands staying during busy seasons. Right now it's just me and Hank, my foreman. He lives in the cabin by the north pasture. The domesticity of the scene struck Harriet suddenly, sitting in this warm kitchen, sharing breakfast with this man as though they'd known each other for years instead of hours. It was disarmingly comfortable. After breakfast, they rode out together, Harriet on a gentle mare Garrett had saddled for her, carrying tools and supplies to repair her wagon. The landscape was transformed in the morning light, rolling hills of green stretching toward distant mountains still capped with snow despite the June heat. It's beautiful, Harriet said softly, taking in the vast open space, so different from Boston's crowded streets. "Most folks just see emptiness," Garrett replied, watching her reaction. "Nice to share it with someone who sees otherwise." They reached her wagon by mid-morning. The damage looked worse in daylight, the entire bottom split from front to back, one wheel broken completely. "Can it be fixed?" she asked, dismay evident in her voice. Most of her worldly possessions were still secured beneath the canvas cover. Garrett was already examining the brake, his expression thoughtful. "Yes, but not quickly. The main beam split clean through. I'll need to replace it entirely." "How long?" 2, maybe 3 days of solid work. He straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "I can take you into Virginia City if you're worried about your position. Come back for your things later." Harriet considered the option, but the thought of arriving in town with nothing but the clothes on her back, dependent on the charity of strangers until her belongings arrived, was unappealing. "If it wouldn't impose too greatly, I'd prefer to wait," she said finally. "I'd like to help with the repairs if possible." Surprise flickered across his face, followed by respect. "It'll be hard work." "I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Reynolds." "I don't doubt that for a minute, Miss Evans." They spent the rest of the day carefully unloading her possessions, transferring them to Garrett's wagon, which he'd brought along behind the horses. Her books, treasured volumes of literature, history, and science that she'd insisted on bringing despite their weight, drew his particular interest. "Quite a collection," he remarked, handling a leather-bound copy of Shakespeare with unexpected reverence. "You planning to use these for teaching?" "Some of them," Harriet replied, watching him carefully turn the pages. "The rest are for my own enjoyment. Books have always been my greatest friends." "Mine too," he said simply, returning the volume to her. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, a momentary contact that shouldn't have sent a jolt of awareness through her, but did. By late afternoon, they had salvaged everything worth keeping and returned to the ranch. Garrett immediately set to work in his workshop, a large outbuilding filled with tools and lumber that spoke to skills Harriet hadn't expected. "You're a carpenter as well as a rancher?" she asked, watching him select boards with a critical eye. "My grandfather was a shipbuilder back east," he explained, measuring carefully. "Taught my father, who taught me. Useful skills out here where the nearest carpenter might be days away." Harriet insisted on helping, and after some protest, Garrett showed her how to sand the rough edges of the boards he cut. They worked side by side through the afternoon, conversation flowing easily between them. She learned he'd come west with his family at 14, that he'd fought briefly in the Civil War, that he raised cattle and horses on his 5,000 acres, and that he read voraciously during the long winter months. In turn, she told him about growing up in Boston, her father's position as a professor of literature, her mother's death from influenza when Harriet was 12, and her decision to come west after her father passed. "Weren't there family members who could have helped you?" Garrett asked as they paused for water, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms tanned by the sun. Harriet shook her head. "My father was an only child, as am I. His cousins made it clear they considered it charitable enough to help with funeral expenses. The teaching position seemed like Providence, a chance to use my education and support myself." "Brave decision," he commented. "Most women would have taken the safer path." "I've never been particularly good at doing what's expected," she admitted with a small smile. "It was my father's greatest complaint and greatest pride," he used to say. "Sounds like a wise man," Garrett replied, his eyes warm as they met hers. "He'd be proud seeing you now, covered in sawdust and rebuilding a wagon in the middle of nowhere." Harriet laughed, brushing ineffectually at the wood particles covering her borrowed work apron. I'm not sure proud is the word he'd choose, but he did raise me to be resourceful. That evening, after a simple supper, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in spectacular shades of orange and pink. Harriet found herself relaxing in the peaceful quiet, her customary guard lowering in this man's steady presence. "Will you be happy teaching?" Garrett asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. The question caught her off guard. "I believe so. I've always loved learning, sharing knowledge." "That's not quite what I asked," he said gently. "Teaching is honorable work, but not everyone who can teach finds joy in it." Harriet considered his words carefully. "Truth be told, I don't know. It was the most respectable option available to me. A woman alone has limited choices. And if choices weren't limited, if you could do anything—" "I would write," she admitted, the words slipping out before she could reconsider. "I've always wanted to write stories that might make a difference, help people see the world differently." "Why don't you?" "Because practical concerns like food and shelter take precedence over dreams," she replied, more sharply than intended. "I'm sorry that sounded ungrateful." "No," Garrett shook his head. "It sounded honest. There's no shame in doing what needs doing to survive. But the best lives make room for dreams too." His words stayed with her as she retired for the night, nestled again in the comfortable guest room that was beginning to feel dangerously familiar after just 2 days. There was something about Garrett Reynolds that made her question the careful plans she'd made, the safe path she'd chosen. It was unsettling and exhilarating all at once. The next morning brought a surprise visitor. Harriet was helping Mrs. Wilkins with bread dough when a woman's voice called from the front door. "Hello, the house. Garrett Reynolds, are you hiding from me?" Mrs. Wilkins rolled her eyes. "That'll be Sophia Miller from the next ranch over. Been setting her cap at Mr. Reynolds for 2 seasons now." Before Harriet could process this information, a striking woman with auburn hair swept into the kitchen. She was fashionably dressed in a riding habit of forest green, her figure shapely, her features pretty if somewhat sharp. "Oh," she stopped short, seeing Harriet. "I didn't realize Garrett had company." "Miss Evans' wagon broke down during the storm," Mrs. Wilkins explained. "Mr. Reynolds is helping with repairs." Sophia's eyes narrowed slightly as she assessed Harriet, taking in her simple dress and flour-dusted hands. How charitable of him. "I'm Sophia Miller. My father owns the Lazy M neighboring ranch to the south." "Harriet Evans," she replied, wiping her hands before offering one. "I'm on my way to Virginia City to take up a teaching position. A school teacher. How? Admirable." The slight pause made the words sound less than complimentary. "Well, I actually came to invite Garrett to dinner tomorrow night. Father's hosting the county commissioner." "I'm afraid I'll have to decline," Garrett's voice came from the doorway. He nodded a greeting to Sophia. "Miss Evans' wagon needs at least another day's work, and I've promised to see her safely to Virginia City after." Sophia's smile tightened. "Surely one of your ranch hands could finish the job. The commissioner is very interested in discussing the new railroad spur. It could be advantageous for you to attend." "I gave my word," Garrett said simply. "Please extend my regrets to your father." The exchange was polite, but Harriet could feel the undercurrents. When Sophia left shortly after, declining refreshments with barely concealed annoyance, Mrs. Wilkins chuckled under her breath. "That one doesn't take disappointment well," she commented, punching down the bread dough with perhaps more force than necessary. "She seemed determined," Harriet offered diplomatically. "The Millers have the second largest spread in the county. Sophia has been raised to believe she deserves the largest, which would be this one, once she marries its owner." Mrs. Wilkins gave Harriet a significant look. "But Mr. Reynolds has shown remarkable resistance to her charms." I'm sure Mr. Reynolds' personal affairs are his own business, Harriet replied primly, though she couldn't deny a certain satisfaction at his refusal of Sophia's invitation. When Mrs. Wilkins left for her midday break, Harriet found Garrett in the workshop, already back at work on the wagon components. "I apologize if my presence caused any awkwardness with your neighbor," she said, picking up her sandpaper to resume where they'd left off the previous day. Garrett shook his head. "Sophia Miller causes her own awkwardness. She's decided I'm a suitable match despite my complete lack of encouragement." "She's very beautiful," Harriet observed, keeping her tone neutral. "Beauty that doesn't reach the eyes isn't worth much," he replied, then looked up with a rueful smile. "That sounds unkind. She's not a bad person, just raised to see marriage as a business arrangement. I want more than that." "What do you want?" The question slipped out before Harriet could stop it. Garrett set down his saw, giving the question real consideration. "A partner. Someone who sees this land the way I do, not as acres to be counted or cattle to be tallied, but as a living thing we're entrusted to care for. Someone who understands that silence can be as comfortable as conversation. Someone who reads by lamplight and isn't afraid to work hard and laugh often." His eyes met hers. "Someone real." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something Harriet wasn't ready to name. She looked away first, focusing intently on the board in her hands. "Those seem like reasonable expectations," she managed finally. "And you, Miss Evans, what do you look for in a match?" "I haven't given it much thought," she lied, knowing full well she'd spent countless hours imagining a partnership of equals, a meeting of minds and hearts. "As I said, a woman alone has practical concerns that take precedence." "Some might say a life companion is the most practical concern of all," Garrett countered softly. They worked in silence after that, but the conversation hung between them, adding new layers to the connection that was growing stronger by the hour. By evening, the wagon repairs were taking shape. The new bottom boards were cut and ready for assembly, and Garrett had managed to repair rather than replace the broken wheel. "One more day should do it," he announced as they washed up for supper. "We can head to Virginia City the day after tomorrow if that suits." Harriet felt a surprising pang at the thought of leaving. 3 days ago she had been focused entirely on reaching Virginia City as quickly as possible. Now she found herself reluctant for this interlude to end. "That would be perfect," she said nonetheless. "You've been more than generous with your time." That night after dinner, rain began to fall again, a gentle patter rather than the previous downpour. They sat in the parlor, the lamp casting a warm glow as Garrett showed her his collection of books. It was an impressive library for a ranch house, with everything from practical manuals on animal husbandry to volumes of poetry and philosophy. "Most of these were my father's," he explained, running his fingers along the spines. "He believed education shouldn't stop just because we left civilization behind. He sounds like a remarkable man. He was. Died 5 years ago. Heart gave out while he was mending fences. Found him with his tools still in his hands." The memory brought a shadow to his eyes. "Mother passed the year before. Thomas stayed until we got through the worst of it, then took the opportunity in Denver." "You must get lonely out here," Harriet said gently. Garrett considered this. "There's a difference between being alone and being lonely." "I have good neighbors, the Millers notwithstanding, ranch hands during busy seasons, friends in town. But yes, sometimes the quiet gets too quiet." He smiled slightly. "That's when the books help most." Harriet nodded in understanding. "That's how I felt after my mother died. Father was lost in his grief for months. Books became my refuge." "What's your favorite?" Garrett asked, genuinely interested. They spent the next hour discussing literature, discovering shared favorites, and playfully debating the merits of different authors. Harriet couldn't remember the last time she'd enjoyed a conversation so thoroughly. Garrett was well-read but unpretentious, his observations insightful without being showy. The rain intensified outside, drumming on the roof as they moved from books to music, to art, to their different experiences of the war that had torn the country apart less than a decade earlier. Time seemed suspended in the warm circle of lamplight, the rest of the world fading away. When the mantel clock struck 10, Harriet reluctantly stood. "I should retire. Tomorrow will be another busy day." Garrett rose as well, standing perhaps a bit closer than propriety dictated. "Thank you for the conversation, Harriet. It's been too long since I've had the pleasure of such good company." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cool night air. "Thank you for the same," she replied, suddenly aware of how alone they were in the house, Mrs. Wilkins having left hours ago. "Good night, Garrett." "Good night," he echoed, making no move to step away. For one breathless moment, Harriet thought he might reach for her, and more surprisingly that she might welcome it. Instead, he simply smiled and stepped back, allowing her to pass. In her room, Harriet sat on the edge of the bed, her heart racing from an encounter that shouldn't have affected her so strongly. She was behaving like a schoolgirl with her first infatuation, not a grown woman of 25 with a teaching position awaiting her. "This is madness," she whispered to herself. "You've known the man 3 days." Yet she couldn't deny there was something between them, a connection that had formed with surprising speed and intensity. It wasn't just physical attraction, though that was undeniably present. It was the way their minds seemed to work in harmony, the ease of their conversations, the shared values that emerged with each passing hour. Tomorrow the wagon would be finished. The day after, she would leave for Virginia City as planned. This interlude, however pleasant, was just that, a brief detour on the path she'd set for herself. Sensible people didn't change life plans based on 3 days' acquaintance, no matter how compelling. With that firmly in mind, Harriet prepared for bed, determined to maintain proper boundaries during her final full day at the Reynolds ranch. Morning dawned clear again, the rain having passed in the night. Harriet rose early, finding Garrett already at work in the barn when she went looking for him after breakfast. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble, looking up from where he was assembling the wagon base. "The repairs are sturdy, but I'm not certain they'll hold all the way to Virginia City without additional reinforcement. The road gets rough past Silver Creek." "What do you suggest?" Harriet asked, rolling up her sleeves to help as she had the previous days. "I'd feel better accompanying you the whole way," he said, his focus seemingly on the wooden joints he was securing. "It's a 2-day journey at wagon pace. If something breaks again, you'd be stranded." Harriet hesitated. The sensible part of her recognized the logic in his offer. The wary part wondered at his motives, and the increasingly problematic part that was drawn to him entirely too much welcomed the prospect of 2 more days in his company. "That seems excessive," she said finally. "You've already been more than generous with your time." "It's not generosity," Garrett replied, finally meeting her eyes directly. "I'd consider it a personal favor if you'd allow me to see you safely to Virginia City." Something in his gaze told her this was important to him, beyond practical concerns about wagon repairs. "Very well," she conceded, "but I insist on compensating you for your time away from the ranch." His expression hardened slightly. "I'm not for hire, Miss Evans." The sudden formality stung. "I meant no offense. I simply don't wish to take advantage." Garrett's face softened. None taken. But please understand this isn't a business arrangement. Where I come from, we help our neighbors without expectation of payment. Are we neighbors, Mr. Reynolds? Harriet asked, the question carrying more weight than the words themselves. His smile returned slowly. For now, and hopefully good friends as well. They worked steadily through the morning, the wagon taking final shape under their combined efforts. By midday, the main structure was assembled, the broken wheel repaired and reinforced. We should test it before loading your belongings, Garrett suggested as they paused for lunch sandwiches and lemonade that Mrs. Wilkins had prepared before departing to help a neighbor with a new baby. The afternoon was spent hitching the repaired wagon to Garrett's team and taking it on a careful circuit around the ranch property. It held well over the various terrain, the repairs proving sound. Your grandfather would be proud, Harriet said as they returned to the barn. That's fine craftsmanship. We did good work, Garrett corrected, emphasizing the we. You're a quick study with tools. The compliment pleased her more than it should have. My father always said I had an engineer's mind trapped in a woman's situation. He meant it kindly, she added, seeing Garrett's expression. He encouraged my interests in science and mathematics even while acknowledging the limitations society placed on their application. The West has fewer such limitations, Garrett observed. Out here, people value competence over convention. If you can do the job, most don't care about the particulars. Is that truly your experience? Harriet asked skeptically. Because mine suggests that women's competence is frequently overlooked regardless of location. Fair point, Garrett conceded. But I like to think we're improving, however slowly. The territory just gave women the vote last year, which the rest of the nation considers scandalously progressive, Harriet noted with a smile. Perhaps there's hope for us yet. They spent the remainder of the afternoon loading Harriet's belongings back into the repaired wagon, securing everything carefully for the journey ahead. The work was physical but satisfying, and Harriet found herself appreciating the practical skills she was learning alongside this unexpected friendship. That evening, their last at the ranch before departing for Virginia City, dinner seemed charged with unspoken words. They ate on the porch, watching the sunset and speaking of practical matters, the route they would take, where they would camp for the night, what provisions were needed. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, Harriet finally voiced the question that had been nagging at her. What will you do after delivering me to Virginia City? Garrett was silent for a long moment, his profile strong against the deepening blue of the evening sky. Return here. The summer cattle drive starts in 2 weeks. There's much to prepare. Of course, Harriet nodded, unsure why she felt disappointed by this entirely expected answer. Though Virginia City is only a day's ride from here, he added, his voice carefully neutral. I come in for supplies monthly. The implication hung in the air between them. He was offering a connection beyond their journey's end. I would welcome a familiar face once I'm settled, Harriet said, equally careful in her phrasing. It's always difficult being the newcomer in a small community. That it is, Garrett agreed, turning to face her fully. The porch lantern cast warm light across his features, his eyes serious as they held hers. Harriet, whatever he intended to say was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Moments later, a rider appeared, recognizable as Hank, Garrett's foreman. Mr. Reynolds, the man called, dismounting quickly. Sorry to disturb your evening, but there's trouble at the north pasture. Couple of cows broke through the fence where the creek flooded. We've got hands looking, but they might have strayed onto Blackwell's property. Garrett was on his feet immediately, tension evident in his stance. Blackwell won't take kindly to that. I'd better come. He turned to Harriet apologetically. I'm sorry, but I need to handle this. Samuel Blackwell has been looking for excuses to cause trouble since our water rights dispute last year. Of course, Harriet said, rising as well. Don't concern yourself about me. I'll try not to be long, Garrett promised, already moving toward the barn. Please make yourself comfortable. There are more books in the study if you're having trouble sleeping. Then he was gone, riding out with Hank into the gathering darkness, leaving Harriet with the distinct feeling that something important had almost been said. She remained on the porch for a while, watching the stars emerge in full glory, so much brighter than they ever appeared in Boston. The vastness of the Montana sky was humbling, making her feel simultaneously insignificant and part of something magnificent. Eventually, the night air grew chill enough to drive her inside. True to Garrett's word, the study contained even more books, journals, and scientific texts primarily, as well as maps and records of the ranch's operations. It was a room that spoke of an organized, thoughtful mind. A leather-bound journal on the desk caught her attention. It lay open, a pen beside it as though recently used. Harriet knew she shouldn't look, but a few lines were visible without intentionally prying. Weather cleared today after the storm. Found unexpected grace in broken things. The city woman with determined eyes sees the land as I do a rare gift I hadn't thought to find. Heat rushed to Harriet's face as she quickly turned away. Those were private thoughts, not meant for her eyes. Yet the words burned in her mind, confirmation that whatever she was feeling wasn't one-sided. She retreated to her bedroom, but sleep proved elusive. The day's physical work should have exhausted her, but her mind raced with possibilities and doubts in equal measure. What was she doing, entertaining thoughts of a man she'd known less than a week? Her future was in Virginia City, teaching children and establishing herself as a respected member of the community. Romance wasn't part of that plan, yet plans changed. Life intervened. A wagon split beneath the rain, and suddenly the path forward looked different. It was past midnight when she heard Garrett return. Footsteps moved quietly through the house, pausing outside her door for the briefest moment before continuing down the hall. Harriet lay awake long after, wondering what tomorrow would bring. She rose with the dawn, having finally fallen into a fitful sleep sometime in the early morning hours. When she entered the kitchen, Garrett was already there, looking weary but satisfied. "Crisis averted," he reported, pouring her coffee. "Found the strays before they got into real trouble. Fence is mended for now, though that section needs a proper rebuilding before winter." "I'm glad it wasn't worse," Harriet said, accepting the cup gratefully. "Are you certain you're still able to accompany me today? You must be exhausted." "Nothing a little coffee won't fix," he assured her with a smile that didn't quite hide his fatigue. "I've managed on less sleep during roundup season." They departed after breakfast, Harriet driving her repaired wagon while Garrett rode alongside on his horse. The day was perfect for traveling clear skies with a gentle breeze that kept the summer heat from becoming oppressive. The landscape unfolded before them, changing subtly as they traveled, rolling grasslands giving way to more rugged terrain, as they approached the mountains where Virginia City nestled in a high valley. They talked easily as they journeyed, sharing stories and observations, falling into comfortable silences when words weren't needed. By late afternoon, they reached Silver Creek, where they would camp for the night before completing the journey to Virginia City the following day. It was a pretty spot, the creek running clear and swift beside a grove of cottonwood trees that offered natural shelter. "This is lovely," Harriet commented as they set up camp, the routine already familiar from their work together over the past days. "One of my favorite spots," Garrett agreed, efficiently building a small fire. My father used to bring us fishing here when we were boys. Those rocks there," he pointed to a formation downstream, "make a natural pool that's perfect for trout." They prepared a simple meal together, then sat by the fire as twilight deepened around them. The sounds of the wilderness water over stones, the occasional owl's call, the whispering of leaves in the breeze created a peaceful backdrop to their conversation. "Are you nervous?" Garrett asked after a comfortable silence. "About starting your new position?" Harriet considered the question honestly. "Yes, though I wouldn't have admitted it a week ago. I know how to teach, but connecting with the children, becoming part of the community, that feels more daunting." "You'll do well," Garrett said with quiet confidence. "You have a way of seeing people clearly. Children respond to that kind of genuine attention." "You speak from experience," he smiled ruefully. "I had a teacher once when I was about 12, Mrs. Hollister, first year after we came west. She saw past my Eastern accent and too fine clothes to the scared boy underneath. Made all the difference in how I adapted. What happened to her? Married the blacksmith the next year. Still lives in the settlement where we first landed. Writes to me every Christmas." The fondness in his voice was evident. "People find their places in unexpected ways out here." The fire crackled between them, sparks rising toward the star-filled sky. Harriet was acutely aware of how alone they were, far from prying eyes or social constraints. Yet Garrett maintained the same respectful distance he'd kept throughout their acquaintance, his manner unfailingly proper despite the intimacy of their situation. "I should be terrified," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the admission. "I'm miles from civilization with a man I barely know. Every cautionary tale I've ever heard would suggest I'm being recklessly naive." "And yet," Garrett prompted gently when she paused. "And yet I've never felt safer," Harriet finished, meeting his gaze directly across the flames. "I trust you, Garrett Reynolds. I can't explain why exactly, but I do." Something shifted in his expression, his eyes darkening with emotion. "Trust is a precious gift," he said, his voice lower than before. "I won't betray it." The moment stretched between them, taut with possibilities neither was quite ready to voice. Finally, Garrett stood, breaking the tension. "We should rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." Harriet nodded, grateful for the reprieve even as part of her wished he'd said something else entirely. They retired to their separate sleeping arrangements, Harriet in the wagon and Garrett nearby on his bedroll under the stars. Sleep came easier than she expected. The sounds of nature and Garrett's reassuring presence nearby lulling her into peaceful rest. She woke at first light to find coffee already brewing over a rekindled fire, Garrett returning from the creek with freshly caught trout for breakfast. "You've been busy," she observed, accepting a cup of the strong, hot coffee. "Couldn't sleep past dawn," he admitted. "Thought I might as well make use of the early hours." They ate quickly and broke camp efficiently, both aware that they were in the final hours of their journey together. The wagon held well as they traveled, climbing steadily into higher elevations where the air grew cooler and the pine forests thicker. By early afternoon, they crested a ridge and Virginia City came into view below them, a bustling mining town nestled in a high mountain valley. Its buildings clustered along a main street with smaller structures spreading outward. "There she is," Garrett said, reining in beside the wagon. "Not much to look at compared to eastern cities, but she's got spirit." Harriet studied her new home with mixed emotions, excitement at the opportunity ahead, apprehension about the unknown, and now a surprising reluctance to end her time with the man beside her. "It looks welcoming," she said, trying to focus on the positive. "More established than I expected." "The school's on the north side," Garrett pointed. "That building with the bell tower. Teachers' quarters are attached to the back, simple but solid construction." They made their way down into the town, drawing curious glances as they traveled the main street. Virginia City in 1873 was past its wildest days, but still very much a frontier community. Women were present but outnumbered, and a new face always attracted attention. The schoolhouse was, as Garrett had described, a straightforward wooden building with a small bell tower, set slightly apart from the main bustle of town. A separate door at the rear led to what would be Harriet's living quarters. As they pulled up outside, a middle-aged man hurried from the building next door, which bore a sign identifying it as the town council office. He was balding, with spectacles and a harried expression that eased somewhat when he saw them. "Miss Evans, Harriet Evans," he called hopefully. "Yes," Harriet replied, setting the brake on her wagon. Relief washed over the man's face. "Oh, thank goodness. I'm Walter Palmer, head of the school board. We were beginning to worry when you didn't arrive as scheduled." "My wagon suffered damage in the storm," Harriet explained as Garrett helped her down. "Mr. Reynolds was kind enough to assist with repairs and escort me here." "Reynolds?" Palmer looked at Garrett with new interest. "From the Triple R. We don't often see you in town outside of supply days." "Special circumstances," Garrett replied with a nod of greeting. "Miss Evans will be an asset to your school," Palmer beamed. "We've been without a proper teacher since Miss Wilson left us at Christmas. The children have had only sporadic instruction since then." He turned to Harriet. "Your references were most impressive, Miss Evans. Harvard-educated father, finishing school, experience tutoring, just what our growing community needs." Harriet felt a flicker of anxiety at the expectations being placed on her, but straightened her shoulders. "I look forward to meeting my pupils and beginning our work together." "School term starts Monday next," Palmer informed her. "That will give you time to settle in and prepare. Now, let me show you your accommodations." The teachers' quarters were basic but clean, a combined sitting room and kitchen, a small bedroom and a tiny washroom. Simple furniture was already in place, though the space felt sterile, unlived in. "It's perfect," Harriet said diplomatically, though the reality of her new life was hitting harder than expected. This small space would be her home, far from everything familiar. "The pump in back provides good water," Palmer was explaining. "Coal and wood shed is shared with the school. Mrs. Palmer would be happy to acquaint you with the town shops, church, and such." "That's very kind," Harriet replied automatically, her mind still adjusting to the abrupt transition. Throughout this exchange, Garrett had been quietly unloading her belongings from the wagon, carrying boxes and trunks inside with efficient movements. His presence was reassuring amid the strangeness of her new surroundings. "Well, I'll leave you to get settled," Palmer said finally. "Mrs. Palmer will call tomorrow morning, shall we say around 10? She can introduce you to some of the other ladies in town." When he had gone, Harriet turned to find Garrett bringing in the last of her things, her precious books, which he set carefully on the empty shelves built into one wall. "Thank you," she said, suddenly aware that their time together was truly ending. "For everything." Garrett straightened, his tall frame making the small room seem even smaller. "You're welcome, Harriet." He glanced around the sparse quarters. "It's not much, but you'll make it your own soon enough." "Yes," she agreed, though her confidence felt hollow. The reality of her decision was sinking in. She was alone in a strange town, about to begin a job she wasn't entirely sure she was prepared for. Garrett seemed to read her thoughts. "The first night is always the hardest," he said gently. "By next week you'll have made friends and found your routine." "Of course," Harriet nodded, forcing a smile. "I'm just tired from the journey." Garrett hesitated, then reached into his pocket. "I have something for you." He extended his hand, revealing a small wooden carving of a bird, a chickadee, perfectly rendered in smooth maple. "I made it while you were sleeping last night," he explained as she took it wonderingly. "My mother always said chickadees are brave beyond their size. Reminded me of you." Harriet traced the delicate details with her fingertip, touched beyond words by the thoughtful gift. "It's beautiful, thank you." "I meant what I said about Virginia City being an easy ride from the ranch," Garrett said, his voice carefully neutral. "I come in regularly for supplies." Harriet looked up from the carving, finding his eyes intent on hers. "I would welcome visitors. The life of a schoolteacher can be somewhat solitary, I understand." "It doesn't have to be," he replied softly. The air between them seemed to vibrate with unspoken possibilities. For a wild moment, Harriet thought he might close the distance between them, but instead, Garrett took a deliberate step back. "I should go," he said, though his expression suggested he wanted anything but. "Give you time to settle in." "Yes, of course," Harriet agreed, professional courtesy masking her disappointment. They walked together to his horse, the repaired wagon now emptied of her possessions. The afternoon sun cast long shadows down Virginia City's Main Street, the bustle of the town continuing around them. "Will you be all right?" Garrett asked, his hand on his saddle but making no move to mount. "I will," Harriet assured him, finding she believed it despite her apprehension. "This is what I came west to do." Garrett nodded, studying her face as if committing it to memory. "You're stronger than you know, Harriet Evans." "As are you, Garrett Reynolds," she replied, allowing her guard to lower just enough to add, "I'm very glad my wagon broke when and where it did." A slow smile spread across his face. "So am I." He mounted his horse with fluid grace, looking down at her from the saddle. "2 weeks," he said. "Supply day, I'll come find you." It wasn't a question, but Harriet answered anyway. "I'll look forward to it." With a final nod, Garrett turned his horse and rode away, not looking back though Harriet watched until he disappeared from view. Only then did she return to her new quarters, the wooden chickadee clutched in her hand like a talisman. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity, as Harriet settled into her role as Virginia City's schoolteacher. Mrs. Palmer proved a friendly if somewhat overwhelming guide to local society, introducing Harriet to what felt like every woman in town during her first days. The school itself presented both challenges and joys. 27 pupils ranging from 6 to 16 years of age, with wildly varying levels of previous education. Some, like the banker's children, had been well tutored. Others, particularly those from mining and ranching families, had spotty attendance at best. Harriet threw herself into the work, developing lessons that would engage the diverse group while advancing everyone's knowledge. She established firm but fair rules, won over several troublemakers with genuine interest in their capabilities, and gradually began to feel she was making a difference. The teacher's quarters became more homelike as she arranged her books, hung the few pictures she'd brought, and added small touches to soften the institutional feel. The wooden chickadee held pride of place on her bedside table, the last thing she saw each night and the first each morning. 2 weeks passed quickly, yet the day Garrett had mentioned supply day loomed large in her mind. She told herself not to expect too much. He had been kind, certainly, but men often made casual promises they had no intention of keeping. Their connection, however genuine it had seemed during those few days together, might not withstand separation or the return to normal routines. Still, when the appointed day arrived, Harriet found herself paying more attention than usual to her appearance before heading to the schoolhouse. It was Saturday, but she had plenty of work to do preparing for the coming week. She was at her desk grading arithmetic papers when a knock came at the classroom door around midday. Her heart jumped, but she composed herself before calling, "Come in." Garrett stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking much as he had 2 weeks prior except perhaps more rested. His eyes found hers immediately, a smile spreading across his face. "Miss Evans," he greeted her formally, though his tone was warm. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, Mr. Reynolds," she replied, rising from her desk with a matching smile she couldn't have suppressed if she tried. "I was just finishing up some grading." He stepped into the classroom, glancing around with interest at the charts and maps she'd hung on the walls, the neat rows of desks, the small library she'd begun organizing in one corner. "You've been busy," he observed approvingly. "As have you, I imagine," Harriet said. "How is the ranch?" "Thriving. The summer drive went well better prices than expected." He moved closer, setting a small package on her desk. "I brought you something from Mrs. Wilkins. She insisted." Harriet unwrapped the package to find a jar of preserved peaches and a small loaf of spice bread. How thoughtful. "Please thank her for me." "You could thank her yourself," Garrett suggested. "Come to dinner tomorrow at the ranch." The invitation surprised her. "Tomorrow? But that's a Sunday, yes," he finished for her. "I know school teachers are expected to set a moral example for the community, but surely even the most stringent school board wouldn't object to a proper dinner with neighbors." Harriet hesitated, though not because she didn't want to accept. "It's a long journey for a dinner." "I thought perhaps you might appreciate a day away from town," Garrett said, watching her carefully. "A chance to breathe different air. I could bring you back Monday morning before school." The propriety of such an arrangement was questionable, but Harriet found herself nodding before she'd fully considered the implications. "I would like that very much." Garrett's expression lightened. "Good. I'll come for you tomorrow morning if that suits." "It does," she agreed, already anticipating Mrs. Palmer's raised eyebrows and inevitable gossip. But for once, Harriet found she didn't particularly care what others might think. They spent another hour together, Garrett helping her rearrange some of the heavier furniture in the classroom while she told him about her first weeks of teaching. It was easy, comfortable, as though their brief separation had never happened. When he left to complete his supply errands, promising to return the next morning, Harriet felt lighter than she had in days. Perhaps it was foolish to place so much importance on this friendship, for that was all it officially was, but she couldn't deny the effect his presence had on her spirits. True to his word, Garrett arrived the following morning with a small buggy rather than his usual horse. Harriet was ready, having informed her landlady that she would be visiting friends for the day and would return Monday morning. The older woman had given her a knowing look but made no comment. The journey to the ranch was filled with easy conversation. Garrett told her about the cattle drive, the new foal born to his favorite mare, the books he'd read in the evenings. Harriet shared stories of her pupils, the characters she was meeting in town, her plans for expanding the school's limited library. "You seem happy," Garrett observed as they neared the ranch, the familiar landscape coming into view. "Teaching suits you." "It does," Harriet agreed, somewhat surprised to realize how true that was. "More than I expected. The children are challenging but rewarding. I feel useful there." "And your writing?" Garrett asked, remembering their conversation from weeks before. "Have you found time for that?" Harriet shook her head. "Not yet. Perhaps once the school term is more established." "Perhaps," Garrett echoed, though something in his tone suggested doubt. The ranch looked just as Harriet remembered, though the summer had advanced, turning some of the lush green to golden hues as autumn approached. It felt strangely like coming home, which was a disconcerting thought for a place she'd spent less than a week. Mrs. Wilkins greeted her warmly, clucking over how thin she looked. "Teaching will wear you to the bone if you let it," and insisting she rest before dinner. Harriet protested she wasn't tired, but did enjoy the chance to freshen up in the same guest room she'd occupied during her previous stay. Dinner was a lively affair. Hank the foreman joined them, along with two other ranch hands, their rough manners softened by obvious respect for both Garrett and their guest. The food was excellent roast beef, vegetables from Mrs. Wilkins' garden, fresh bread, and a berry pie that rivaled any Harriet had tasted in Boston. After the meal, the hands excused themselves, and Mrs. Wilkins departed for her cottage, leaving Harriet and Garrett alone on the porch as the evening cooled around them. "Thank you for inviting me," Harriet said, breathing in the scent of pine and grass and open space. "I hadn't realized how much I missed this." "The ranch?" Garrett asked, his voice holding a note of pleased surprise. "The space," Harriet clarified, though that wasn't the entire truth. "Virginia City is lovely, but sometimes it feels confined." "The hazards of civilization," Garrett agreed with a small smile. "Would you like to walk? There's still plenty of light." They strolled together along a path that led through an apple orchard and down toward a small pond. The setting sun cast everything in golden light, making the scene almost painfully beautiful. "I've been thinking," Garrett said after a comfortable silence, "about what you said regarding writing, about not having time." "A common lament among working people, I imagine," Harriet replied lightly. "Yes, but—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "What if you had a different arrangement, one that allowed more freedom for your own pursuits?" Harriet glanced at him curiously. "What sort of arrangement?" Garrett stopped walking, turning to face her directly. The fading sunlight caught in his hair, highlighting strands of gold among the brown. "Virginia City is growing. They need more than one teacher. The school board has mentioned possibly hiring an assistant next year if enrollment continues to increase," Harriet acknowledged, unsure where he was heading with this observation. "What if you weren't alone in the meantime? What if you had a partner?" Harriet's breath caught as his meaning began to dawn on her. "Garrett, what exactly are you suggesting?" He took a deep breath, as though gathering courage. "I'm suggesting that perhaps the wagon breaking wasn't just bad luck. Perhaps it was the beginning of something neither of us was looking for but found anyway." "We've known each other less than a month," Harriet pointed out, though her heart was racing. "Time matters less than understanding," Garrett countered. "I've known people for years without truly seeing them. With you, it was different from the start." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the varying shades of gray and blue in his eyes. "I'm not asking for an answer today, Harriet. I'm asking you to consider possibilities, to consider us." "Us," she repeated softly, the word holding more meaning than she'd ever attributed to it before. "Yes," Garrett confirmed, reaching slowly for her hand, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, he laced his fingers with hers, the contact sending warmth spreading up her arm. "I care for you, more than I thought possible in so short a time. I believe you might feel something similar." Harriet knew she should be cautious, should consider all the practical implications, should take time to reflect. Instead, she found herself saying, "I do." The simple admission changed something in Garrett's expression, hope blazing briefly before he controlled it. "Then perhaps we could begin with letters. Regular visits when possible. Get to know each other properly, with time and patience." It was so reasonable, so thoughtful, so like him to suggest a measured approach when every fiber of her being suddenly wanted to throw caution to the winds. "I would like that," Harriet agreed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Though letters seem a poor substitute when we're only a day's ride apart." "Distance has its purposes," Garrett said ruefully. "Keeps me from rushing what should unfold naturally." The restraint he was showing only increased Harriet's admiration, and her certainty that whatever was growing between them was worth exploring. Here was a man who considered her wishes, who saw her as an equal partner, who valued her mind as well as her company. "Then we shall correspond," she decided, squeezing his hand gently, "and visit, and see where the path leads us." Garrett's smile was like sunrise breaking across his features. "I believe it leads somewhere extraordinary, Harriet Evans." As the final light faded from the sky, they walked back to the ranch house hand in hand. The future suddenly richer with possibilities than either had imagined when a broken wagon had brought them together beneath the rain. The following months passed in a rhythm neither had anticipated but both embraced wholeheartedly. True to their agreement, Garrett and Harriet exchanged letters weekly, substantive communications that explored their thoughts, beliefs, hopes, and histories in a depth conversation alone might never have achieved. Garrett visited Virginia City regularly, always making time to see Harriet regardless of how brief his stay in town might be. Sometimes these visits were nothing more than a shared meal or a walk along the creek that ran behind the schoolhouse. Other times, when his business allowed, they spent full days together riding in the hills surrounding the town, picnicking in meadows bright with wildflowers, or simply sitting side by side in the small parlor of her quarters, reading in comfortable silence. Once a month, weather permitting, Harriet made the journey to the ranch, staying either overnight with Mrs. Wilkins as chaperone or, as winter made travel more difficult, for an entire weekend. These visits became precious interludes in her increasingly busy teaching life, chances to breathe freely and reconnect with both Garrett and herself. The people of Virginia City watched this courtship with varying degrees of interest and approval. Mrs. Palmer was delighted, having worried about their dear teacher being too isolated. The school board members were more concerned, extracting promises that Miss Evans' personal affairs would not interfere with her teaching duties. The children, with the directness of youth, simply asked if Mr. Reynolds was her beau, accepting her carefully worded affirmative with matter-of-fact nods before returning to their lessons. As autumn deepened into winter, their relationship grew accordingly. What had begun as an unexpected connection blossomed into something neither had experienced before, a partnership of equals, founded on mutual respect and deepening affection. They discovered shared values, complementary strengths, and differences that enhanced rather than divided them. Harriet found in Garrett someone who encouraged her dreams rather than dismissing them as impractical fancies. He created space in the study at the ranch for her writing, ensuring she had quiet, uninterrupted time during her visits. When she hesitantly showed him her first completed story, a tale of a young girl finding her place in a frontier community, his genuine enthusiasm gave her courage to send it to a magazine back east. In turn, Garrett found in Harriet a woman who saw beyond the successful rancher to the man, beneath a man with doubts and hopes and unspoken dreams of his own. Her presence in his life, even at a distance, transformed the ranch from simply his workplace to truly his home. The hours they spent together, whether working side by side on practical tasks or discussing books late into the evening, filled a loneliness he had grown so accustomed to he'd almost forgotten its presence. Christmas brought their first significant milestone. Harriet had planned to spend the holiday in Virginia City, participating in school festivities before enjoying a quiet day to herself. Instead, a severe snowstorm closed the mountain passes 3 days before Christmas, making travel impossible and cutting the town off temporarily from surrounding areas. Garrett, who had been checking fence lines on the far side of his property when the storm hit, returned home to find a telegram waiting. Harriet was stranded in Virginia City for the duration. Without hesitation, he packed provisions, hitched his strongest team to a sleigh, and set out before dawn the following day, determined to reach her before Christmas Eve. The journey was arduous, the trail barely visible beneath fresh snow, but he persevered, arriving in Virginia City as dusk fell on December 23rd. Harriet, who had resigned herself to a solitary holiday, opened her door to find Garrett on her doorstep, snow-covered and exhausted but triumphant. "You shouldn't have come," she scolded, even as she pulled him inside out of the biting cold. "It's dangerous in these conditions." "Merry Christmas to you too," he replied, stamping snow from his boots. "And I disagree. Some journeys are worth the risk." They spent Christmas Eve with several of Harriet's fellow teachers and a few families from town who had taken a liking to the schoolteacher and her rancher beau. Christmas Day was theirs alone, a perfect day of simple pleasures shared. They exchanged modest gifts, a fine leather-bound journal from Garrett to Harriet, a hand-knitted scarf from Harriet to Garrett. But the true gift, both acknowledged, was the time together. As they sat before the fire that evening, snow falling gently outside the small window of Harriet's quarters, Garrett took her hand in his. "I had planned to wait until spring," he said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "to give us more time. But these past months have only confirmed what I suspected that day by the pond." Harriet's heart began to race, hope and apprehension mingling in equal measure. "And what was that?" "That you are the one I want to build a life with." His eyes, earnest and vulnerable, held hers. "I love you, Harriet Evans. I believe I started falling in love with you when I found you standing beside that broken wagon in the rain, too proud to admit you needed help but brave enough to accept it when offered." Tears pricked at Harriet's eyes, but she blinked them back, not wanting to miss a moment of his face in this precious instant. "And I love you, Garrett Reynolds, though I tried very hard not to at first." His laugh was soft, joyful. "I noticed. You're not as inscrutable as you might hope." "So I've been told," she agreed with a watery smile. Garrett shifted, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small box. "I'm not asking for an immediate answer. I know you have commitments to the school, to the community you're building here, but I want you to know my intentions, my hopes." He opened the box to reveal a ring not ostentatious, but beautiful in its simplicity. A deep blue sapphire flanked by two smaller diamonds set in polished silver. "It was my grandmother's," he explained, "blue like the Montana sky." Harriet stared at the ring, then at Garrett's face, finding there all the sincerity and love she could ever hope for. In that moment, the careful plans she'd made for her life seemed pale and colorless compared to the vibrant future he was offering. "Yes," she said simply. Garrett blinked. "Yes. But I haven't properly asked yet." "Then ask," Harriet challenged, her smile growing, setting the box carefully aside. Garrett took both her hands in his expression solemn despite the joy radiating from him. "Harriet Evans, will you marry me? Will you make a life with me, sharing all that comes, good and difficult alike?" "Yes," she repeated, the single syllable containing all her hopes and dreams for their future. "With all my heart, yes." The kiss that followed sealed their promise, tender at first, then deepening as they allowed themselves to express physically what they had been saying in words and actions for months. When they finally parted, both breathless and flushed, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "I should warn you," he said softly, "I'm not an easy man to live with. I work too hard, think too much, and sometimes forget to say what I'm feeling. And I'm stubborn, occasionally too independent for my own good, and have a tendency to lose track of time when I'm writing or reading," Harriet countered. "We'll manage." Garrett slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit as though made for her. "We'll do more than manage, Harriet. We'll thrive." They agreed to a spring wedding after the school term ended. The following months were filled with preparations, both practical and emotional. The school board, informed of Harriet's engagement and impending departure, began searching for a replacement teacher. The ranch underwent subtle changes: the addition of a proper library space, improvements to the kitchen, a new garden plot planned with Harriet's preferences in mind. Letters and visits continued, their frequency increasing as their wedding day approached. Harriet found herself dividing her life into before and after, not just before and after marriage, but before and after Garrett. Before and after discovering what it meant to be truly seen and valued for exactly who she was. April brought the first wildflowers, carpeting the valleys in vibrant color, just as Garrett had described that very first day. May brought the end of the school term and Harriet's fond farewells to the children who had become so dear to her. And June, glorious June, brought their wedding day. They married on the ranch, beneath an arbor Garrett had built himself, surrounded by friends from both Virginia City and the surrounding ranches. Mrs. Wilkins cried unabashedly. Mr. Palmer gave a speech about the community's loss being the ranch's gain, and even Sophia Miller attended, her new fiancé, a railroad executive from Helena, firmly by her side. As they spoke their vows, Harriet looked into Garrett's eyes and saw their future reflected: their days of work and evenings of conversation, children with his strength and her curiosity, books read aloud by lamplight, challenges faced together, joys multiplied by sharing. It was everything she had never known to want until a broken wagon brought them together. The celebration lasted well into the night, but eventually the last guests departed, leaving the newlyweds alone at last. Standing on the porch of what was now truly their home, Garrett wrapped his arms around Harriet from behind, both of them gazing up at the star-filled Montana sky. "Happy?" he asked, his voice a rumble she could feel against her back. "Completely," she assured him, leaning into his embrace. "Though I was just thinking about how differently everything might have turned out if my wagon hadn't broken that day. I like to think we would have found each other anyway," Garrett mused. "Some connections are meant to be." "The practical New Englander in me doubts that," Harriet replied with a smile, "but the writer in me loves the idea." Garrett turned her in his arms, his expression tender in the moonlight. "Then let's believe it together. After all, we fixed that broken wagon together. Surely we can construct a reasonable narrative." Harriet laughed, joy bubbling up irrepressibly. "I love you, Garrett Reynolds." "And I love you, Harriet Reynolds," he returned, the new name sending a thrill through her. "Welcome home." As they stepped inside together, Harriet knew with absolute certainty that the broken wagon had been the beginning of something extraordinary, a love story written not in the pages of a book, but in the shared moments of real life, with all its unexpected turns and precious discoveries. A story still being written, one day at a time, together.